It was pouring outside, a relentless, drumming rain that blurred the city lights and drowned out every sound, except for the hollow echo of water hitting pavement. I was standing on the rooftop parking lot, watching from a distance that felt as if it was stretched for miles, though I was only a few yards away. She didn't see me. She couldn't, not with her back to me, laughing at some joke told by the man beside her. That laugh, carefree and low, had once belonged to me, but now it danced between them, mingling with the fog that rolled across the rooftop, disappearing into the night. I hadn't meant to see them. I'd left work late, trudging through the rain, too tired even to care that I'd forgotten my umbrella. I was soaked through by the time I reached the parking garage, but as I stepped out from the elevator, there they were. Her asterisk, she asterisk was, with asterisk, him asterisk, standing under a dim flickering light, looking like a scene out of a movie that I would never have wanted to watch. My heart pounded, blood rushing so loud in my ears that I could barely hear her laughter. She reached out, playfully smacking his arm, and then she lingered. I could see her fingers pause just a moment too long against his sleeve, and he responded, leaning slightly toward her. My stomach twisted as he tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, his hand staying at her cheek just a little longer than any casual gesture would allow. I could only stare, paralyzed as he leaned in closer, their laughter dying down, replaced by a hushed intimacy that seemed too much to bear. She tilted her head ever so slightly, meeting him halfway, and that's when their lips met, brief, soft, as if this were just the beginning of something. I felt like I was intruding on a private moment, yet it was my life, my asterisk, wife asterisk that they had stolen into. I backed away into the shadows, my footsteps silent on the wet concrete. My mind raced, each thought tangling into the next, impossible to separate. How had we even gotten here? A year ago, she'd been my everything, my partner in every sense. But as I walked away, I could feel an emptiness where our connection used to be, a hollow ache that grew with every step. It had all been so subtle, the changes, so quiet. The night she worked late, the sudden flurry of texts that she'd brush off with a shrug, or the way she'd grown distant, talking in half sentences that left me feeling like an outsider in my own life. I made it back to my car, slumping into the driver's seat, staring blankly at the rain, breaking down the windshield. She hadn't seen me, hadn't noticed a thing. For a moment, I imagined confronting her, stepping out into the light, shouting her name, and demanding an answer. But the anger in my chest was dulled by the overwhelming confusion and grief that weighed down on me, pressing me into the seat. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I couldn't look her in the eye, knowing what I'd seen. Not until I understood what it meant. For her, for us, for everything we'd built. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, merging onto the nearly empty road, the wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. I drove without direction, passing familiar streets and neon-lit storefronts that blurred in my peripheral vision. My hands gripped the steering wheel, fingers clenched so tight my knuckles turned white. Each stoplight brought a new wave of nausea, a new replay of that moment on the rooftop. The closeness, the warmth, the betrayal that wasn't even mine to claim, but that shattered something inside me all the same. By the time I reached home, I was drenched in more than just rain. I sat in the driveway, watching the lights flicker behind the curtains, knowing she'd be inside, likely already changed into comfortable clothes, wrapped in the comfort of a place that still felt like home, at least to her. For me, everything looked foreign. The rooms I once cherished, now feeling like a set, a prop in a scene that no longer belonged to me. I took a deep breath, finally stepping out of the car and letting myself into the house. She was in the kitchen, rinsing a glass at the sink. She looked up and smiled, an automatic reaction, nothing more. But I could still see the warmth in her eyes, the familiarity, the love that for a second felt as real as it had always been. But then my mind returned to the rooftop, and my own smile died on my lips. I mumbled something about having had a long day, blaming the weather for my soaked appearance. She nodded, drying her hands, not even glancing at the clock to see how late it had gotten. That night, as she slipped into bed beside me, pulling the covers up to her chin, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting the raindrops that splattered against the window. Each one felt like a reminder, a ticking clock, counting down to some inevitable end. I could feel her warmth next to me, her breathing slow and even, her arm brushing against mine as she shifted in her sleep. I wanted to turn toward her, to reach out and pull her close, to pretend nothing had changed. But all I could see was her face under that dim rooftop light, leaning in toward someone else, her laughter a faint echo in the back of my mind. I lay there for hours, sleep eluding me. Every thought a jumbled mess of questions I didn't dare ask out loud. When the first light of dawn broke through the window, I felt the weight of the night pressing down on me, and I knew things couldn't stay the same. Something had shifted. And now, even if it took everything I had, I would find out what had gone wrong. A few days passed, but the memory of that rooftop scene haunted me, creeping into every quiet moment, stealing my focus at work and filling my thoughts at night. I knew I couldn't keep this up, couldn't keep burying the images, the sounds, the reality of what I'd seen. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that maybe I'd misread things. After all, it was just a kiss. Maybe it didn't mean anything. Maybe I was overreacting, but the weight of that lie sat heavily in my chest, pressing down, refusing to let me breathe. I decided I needed to talk to her, find some clarity, but each time I tried, the words died on my lips. She was either busy, rushing out the door with her phone in hand, or lost in her own thoughts, a distant look in her eyes. I kept telling myself that tonight would be the night I'd say something, that I'd finally have the courage to ask the questions that gnawed at me. Yet when the night came, I lost my nerve. Then, on a chilly Thursday evening, I asked her if we could spend some time together. I suggested dinner at a small restaurant downtown, one of our favorites, but she hesitated, checking her phone before giving me a forced smile and agreeing. I wanted to believe she was just distracted, that work or life had her preoccupied. But as she disappeared into the bedroom to get ready, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling her away from me. We walked into the restaurant in silence, and I could feel the distance between us like a solid wall. She sat across from me, scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the screen. I cleared my throat, trying to catch her attention, but she barely glanced up. I felt my frustration rising, a thick knot forming in my chest. I opened my mouth, ready to confront her, to demand some kind of explanation. But instead, I bit back my words, reminding myself that this wasn't the time. Not here, not now. After dinner, she claimed she was tired and asked if I'd mind if she met up with some friends instead of going straight home. My heart sank, but I forced a smile, telling her it was fine, even though every part of me wanted her to stay. She gave me a quick hug, barely meeting my eyes, and slipped away, disappearing into the house. Cool night, not sure what else to do. I wandered aimlessly through the city streets, the sounds of traffic and laughter filling the air around me. I told myself I should just go home, let her have her space, but my feet carried me in the opposite direction. Before I realized it, I found myself outside a small cafe near the park, the same cafe where I'd seen her and our friend that rainy night. The memories flooded back, and my heart clenched as I looked through the cafe's glass windows. And there she was, sitting at a small corner table. She hadn't seen me yet, but I couldn't look away. Her head was tilted slightly, her smile soft as she listened to him talk, her hand resting on the edge of the table, just close enough that their fingers almost touched. I shared a laugh, and for a moment she looked more alive, more herself than I'd seen in weeks. She leaned in, her face inches from his, her eyes shining in a way I hadn't seen in so long. Then before I could turn away, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against her cheek in a gentle, almost reverent gesture. She didn't pull back. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, leaning into his touch. I felt a surge of anger, raw and burning, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as he leaned closer, their faces mirror inches. It was a kiss that felt like a secret, something they'd shared 1,000 times before. Something I had no pardon. A sharp pain sliced through me and I stumbled back, heart pounding as I turned and hurried away. I walked blindly, the city lights blurring around me, a cold wind cutting through my jacket as I tried to process what I'd just seen. There was no denying it now, no pretending it was a misunderstanding or some fleeting moment of weakness. Whatever was happening between them was real, tangible, something that had crossed the line. I thought we'd both sworn never to breach. When I finally made it home, the silence felt oppressive, the walls closing in around me. As I sat in the dark, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself that I'd confront her, that I'd demand answers, that I deserved to know the truth. But as the hours ticked by, my anger faded, replaced by a hollow, gnawing ache. She hadn't come home yet, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be here when she did. The house was quiet, empty, and for the first time I realized it no longer felt like home. The next day, I woke with a sense of determination. The previous night had drained me, left me hollow and raw, but I knew I couldn't ignore. She was avoiding me, slipping further away with each passing day. And if I didn't confront her now, I might never get the chance. I rehearsed what I wanted to say, pacing back and forth in the empty kitchen, the words falling apart the moment I tried to shape them into sentences. But when I heard her car pull into the driveway, my heart picked up, steadying me with a strange sense of purpose. She walked into the house, her expression unreadable, a faint exhaustion in her eyes. I noticed how she moved quietly, almost as if she was trying not to disturb the air between us. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can we talk?" I asked, gesturing to the living room. She looked at me for a moment, her face giving nothing away, then nodded and followed me. The silence that stretched between us was thick, stifling, and I felt my throat tighten as I tried to gather the courage to speak. "I know something's been going on." My voice softer than I intended. She didn't react, just looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting slightly. I felt a surge of frustration, a need for her to acknowledge it, to give me even a hint that she understood the weight of what I was saying. "I've seen you," I continued, my voice firmer now. "I saw you with him." Her eyes flickered up at me then, a glint of surprise, but she quickly composed herself, masking whatever emotions might have been there. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, her tone calm, almost too calm. It was like talking to a stranger, someone who had mastered the art of hiding behind words, and it made my heart ache in a way I couldn't describe. "Nothing is going on," she added, her voice so steady, so convincing that for a brief, painful moment I almost wanted to believe her. But the memory of their kiss was too vivid, too real to ignore. "Please," I said, a hint of desperation creeping into my voice. "Just be honest with me. I saw the way you looked at him." "Everything." She went silent, her gaze dropping again, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she tried to keep herself composed. There was a long pause, and in that silence, I felt the fragile remnants of trust between us begin to shatter. Finally, she took a shaky breath as if steeling herself. "All right," she whispered, almost too softly. "Maybe you're right. Maybe something did happen." My heart sank, a dull ache spreading through my chest. I waited, not daring to move, not daring to breathe, afraid that if I did, this moment would slip away and I'd be left with nothing but unanswered questions. "It wasn't supposed to be anything," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It just happened." Her words felt like shards of glass, each one slicing deeper, and I struggled to keep my emotions in check. I wanted to ask her why, to demand an explanation, to understand what had led us to this point. But as I looked at her, saw the guilt and hesitation in her eyes, I realized that no explanation would make it hurt any less. "So what now?" I asked, my voice hollow, drained of everything but a quiet resignation. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Maybe regret, maybe relief, maybe a mix of both. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't want to hurt you." Those words, simple and unassuming, hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I wanted to scream, to tell her that she had already hurt me, that every moment of the past few weeks had been a slow, agonizing spiral into a truth I wasn't ready to face. But instead, I just nodded, the weight of her admission settling heavily on my shoulders. She had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone, and now we were standing on opposite sides of an unbridgeable chasm. The silence returned, stretching between us, filled with all the words we couldn't say, all the emotions we couldn't express. I felt like I was drowning in it, suffocating under the weight of everything we'd left. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice barely audible. Maybe we should take some time apart," she suggested, her words hesitant, uncertain, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to say them out loud. I looked at her, feeling a surge of disbelief. This was it, her solution, her answer to everything we'd built, everything we'd shared. Part of me wanted to argue, to fight for us, to hold on to whatever fragile connection remained, but another part, a quieter, more tired part, understood that this was what she truly wanted. She needed space, distance, a way to escape the consequences of her actions. "All right," I replied, my voice hollow, emotionless. "If that's what you need." The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong to me, and yet they were the only thing I could say. She looked at me, a mixture of sadness and relief in her eyes. And for a moment I thought she might reach out, might try to bridge the gap between us. But she didn't. Instead, she gave a small nod, standing up slowly, as if the weight of her decision was finally settling in. As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of emptiness, a hollow ache that stretched across my chest, leaving me numb. I sat there staring at the empty space she'd left behind, feeling the quiet finality of her departure. There was no more pretense, no more excuses. She had made her choice, and I was left to pick up the pieces of what remained. I stayed there for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a muted, somber light. The world outside continued unchanged, unaware of the quiet devastation unfolding within these walls. And as the night settled in, I realized that this was it. The end of something I had once believed unbreakable. The days that followed felt surreal, as if I were moving through a life that no longer fit me. The house was quiet, oppressively so, each room filled with memories that seemed to mock me. Every corner, every piece of furniture held fragments of a life I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. I hadn't seen her since that evening. She had gone to stay with her sister, a temporary arrangement, she had called it. Temporary, yet somehow it already felt permanent. I went about my daily routine with a numbness that dulled everything. Work became a place to escape, a realm where I could immerse myself in tasks and numbers, a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside me. But as soon as I left the office, the ache returned, filling the car with silence, following me down the empty streets as I drove aimlessly, reluctant to go back to a house that felt foreign. I hadn't spoken to anyone about what happened. I wasn't sure I could put it into words without feeling like something in me might unravel completely. One evening, while I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone, I noticed she had posted a picture on social media. It was simple: a coffee cup on a table, an open book beside it, sunlight streaming in through the window. The caption read, "Finding Peace." I felt a pang as I stared at it, wondering if she had already found the peace I was so desperately searching for. Did she miss me at all? Did she feel even a fraction of the emptiness that had settled into my bones? I closed my eyes, trying to push away the thoughts. But they kept coming. They were relentless, memories of her laughter. The way she'd once looked at me with such warmth. The little moments we'd shared that felt so insignificant then, but now seemed monumental. Each memory was like a shard, sharp and unforgiving, piercing through the numbness. I couldn't understand how something that had felt so solid could crumble so quickly, leaving me grappling with a sense of loss that words couldn't contain. The next morning, I woke up to a text from her. It was short, just a few lines asking if she could come by to pick up some things. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding as I read her message over and over. It was such a simple request, but it felt loaded, as if hidden beneath those words was an entire conversation we hadn't had. I replied with a curt, "Sure," then tossed my phone aside, feeling a strange mix of dread and anticipation. That evening, I found myself pacing the living room, glancing at the clock, waiting for her to arrive. When I heard her car pull up, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was to come. She walked in quietly, her expression unreadable, her steps cautious, as if she were walking on thin ice. I watched her as she moved around the room, picking up a few belongings, slipping them into a bag without a word. Is this it?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She paused, her back to me, her shoulders tense. For a moment I thought she wouldn't answer, that she would leave without saying anything. But then she turned, her eyes meeting mine, a mixture of sadness and something else, something I couldn't quite name. "I don't know," she said, her voice soft, almost fragile. "I don't have the answers. I just know that I need space. I need time to figure things out." Her words hung in the air, heavy with an uncertainty that only deepened the ache in my chest. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Time," I repeated, as if the word itself might somehow offer clarity. "How much time?" She looked away, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know," she replied, her voice wavering. Maybe a few weeks, maybe longer." Her words hit me like a cold splash of water, each one adding weight to the already unbearable heaviness pressing down on me. She didn't know. She couldn't even give me that small comfort. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to stay composed. So what am I supposed to do? Just wait? Pretend this isn't happening? She looked back at me then, her expression pained. I don't expect you to wait, she said quietly. I don't know what to expect. I just need to figure out who I am, who we are. The words felt hollow, an echo of every cliché I'd ever heard. And yet, coming from her, they somehow felt real, cutting through me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I looked at her, trying to find some trace of the person I had once known, the person I had built a life with. But all I saw was a stranger, someone I barely recognized. But another word. She turned and walked toward the door, pausing only briefly as she looked back. "Take care of yourself," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Then she was gone, leaving the room filled with a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I sank onto the couch, the weight of her departure settling heavily around me. Every sound, every creak of the house felt amplified, each one a painful reminder of her absence. I couldn't believe that this was it. That after everything we'd been through, we were reduced to a few hollow words and an empty house. The finality of it was crushing, and yet in that silence I felt a strange, bitter clarity. The following days passed in a blur, each one bleeding into the next, a monotonous routine of work, sleep, and an emptiness I couldn't escape. I kept hoping for a text, a call, some sign that she might come back, that this was all just temporary. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope began to fade, leaving behind a hollow ache that I couldn't shake. I began to wonder if I had ever really known her, if the life we had built was just an illusion, a fragile construct that had shattered the moment it was tested. I thought about reaching out, about trying to bridge the gap between us, but every time I picked up the phone, I felt a wave of hesitation. What could I possibly say that hadn't already been said? What could I offer that might change her mind? And so I did nothing. I let the silence stretch on, let the days pass, each one taking me further from the life I had once known. I threw myself into work, into a routine that offered some semblance of stability, a way to keep the pieces of myself from falling apart. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the ache remained, a constant reminder of the life I had lost. The weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, the hope I had once clung to faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. She had made her choice, and now I was left to pick up the pieces, to rebuild a life that no longer felt like my own. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I would ever find the peace that had. But as I looked out at the world beyond my empty home, I knew one thing with a painful certainty: there was no going back. The house felt emptier with each passing day, a hollow shell of the life we'd once shared. Days had bled into weeks, weeks into months, and I was still here, still trying to adjust to the quiet, the absence, and the ache that filled every empty room. I had tried to move on, to pick up the pieces and carry on as though her absence was just a temporary pause. But no matter what I did, the weight of her leaving lingered like an unwelcome shadow. It was a strange kind of grief, one that settled into the bones, coloring even the simplest things with a dull sense of loss. One evening, as I sat alone, I heard a soft chime from my phone, breaking the silence that had settled around me. It was a message from an old friend of ours, someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. The text was brief, almost casual. "Hey, it's been a while. Let's catch up sometime." Asterisk. There was nothing unusual about it on the surface, but something in me hesitated. This was someone who had known both of us, who had been there from the beginning, through the highs and lows of our relationship. And now, with everything that had happened, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the reminders that he might bring. But loneliness has a way of softening even the sharpest hesitations. So I replied, agreeing to meet up. We arranged to meet at a small bar downtown, a place we'd all frequented years ago, back when everything was still simple. As I walked through the doors, I was flooded with memories. Laughter, shared stories, the warmth of friendships that had once felt unbreakable. But tonight, everything felt different. A reminder of a past that felt further away than ever. He was already there, sitting at a corner table, a faint smile breaking across his face as he waved me over. As we settled into a conversation, the awkwardness slowly faded, replaced by the easy camaraderie that comes with familiarity. We talked about work, the mundane details of daily life, avoiding any mention of the one topic that hung heavily in the air. I could tell he was trying to gauge my mood, to find a way to bring it up without breaking the fragile peace we had found. Finally, he cleared his throat, looking down at his drink before speaking. "So, how have you been holding up?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight that went beyond the words. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal, of whether I was even ready to talk about. But something in his gaze urged me to open up, to let go of the guard I had been holding so tightly. "It's been strange," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I knew her, thought I knew us. But now, looking back, it feels like I was seeing only what I wanted to see." The words came out slowly, haltingly, as if I were piecing together fragments of a truth I hadn't fully acknowledged. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's tough. I mean, from the outside, everything looked perfect." He paused, searching for the right words. "But I guess we never really know what's going on inside someone else's life, do we?" The conversation drifted, touching on memories and shared experiences, each one tinged with a sense of loss. As we talked, I felt a strange sense of clarity, a realization that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I had thought. He had known her too, had seen the changes, the shifts in our lives, even if he hadn't fully understood them. But then, as the evening wore on, he dropped a bombshell that left me reeling. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had seen her around, and not alone. She had been with him, the same man I had seen her with that night on the rooftop. They'd been spotted together, frequenting the same places, as if their lives had seamlessly intertwined while mine had fallen apart. I felt my stomach twist, a familiar wave of anger and betrayal rising within me. I had suspected, of course, I wasn't blind to the signs, but hearing it confirmed, knowing that she was moving on, living a life without me, was something I hadn't been prepared for. I tried to keep my expression neutral, to act as though his words hadn't cut as deeply as they had, but I could feel my hands clenching under the table, my body tense with barely restrained. He seemed to notice, his face softening as he looked at me. "I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean to bring it up like that. I just thought you should know." His words were sincere, his regret evident, but they did little to ease the ache in my chest. I nodded, swallowing hard, forcing a smile. "No, it's fine. Really, I guess I needed to hear it." The words felt hollow, but I forced myself to say them, to keep up the pretense of calm, even as my mind spun with thoughts I couldn't control. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, the conversation drifting to lighter topics as we both tried to ignore the weight of what had just been said. But as I walked home that night, the streets empty and silent, I felt the full force of the reality I had been avoiding. She was gone, truly gone, and there was nothing I could do to change it. Back at home, I sat in the dark, letting the silence settle around me, trying to process everything. I thought about reaching out to her, about asking her for answers, for some kind of closure. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. She had made her choice, and all I could do now was try to find a way to move on. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of resolve. It wasn't peace, not by any means, but it was a quiet determination, a need to take control of my life again. I decided to start small, making changes to the house, rearranging furniture, packing away things that reminded me of her. It was a slow, painful process, but with each step I felt a little lighter, a little closer to finding myself again. As the days turned into weeks, I began to carve out a new routine, one that didn't revolve around her. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I had long abandoned, filled my time with things that brought me a sense of purpose, however small. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the ache returned, a dull reminder of the life, but slowly I began to heal, to find a semblance of normalcy in the life I was rebuilding. One evening, as I sat alone looking out at the city lights, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was fleeting, fragile, but it was there, a reminder that life would go on, that I could still find happiness, even in the wake of everything I had been through. And for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, I would be okay. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm, one that no longer revolved around the pieces of a shattered marriage. I'd grown accustomed to the quiet, learned to fill the silence with books, music, the faint hum of city life drifting in through open windows. There was a kind of peace in it, though it was a lonely peace, one I hadn't expected to embrace but found myself clinging to. Then one night, as I was sorting through a box of old things I'd nearly forgotten about, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at it, expecting a message from a friend. maybe a reminder of some forgotten appointment, but the name on the screen froze me in place. It was her. My hands were unsteady as I picked up the phone. Her message was short, simple, almost cold. "Can we meet?" I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, questions swirling in my mind. After all this time, after the distance, the silence, why reach out? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave her message unread like a chapter I'd closed. But against my better judgment, I found myself replying, setting a time and place as if in a trance. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, one we'd once loved. She was already there, sitting by the window, her expression unreadable. I sat across from her, the weight of everything unspoken filling the space between us. She looked at me, opened her mouth to speak, then hesitated. Finally she spoke, her voice a whisper. I'm not sure I made the right choice. The words hit me harder than I'd expected, piercing through the quiet defenses I'd built. I didn't know what to say, didn't know if there was anything left to say. She looked away, her eyes misting slightly, as if realizing the impact of her own confession. And then as I searched for words, she reached out, her hand trembling, stopping just short of touching mine. Her eyes met mine, filled with a sadness I'd never seen before. And in that moment, I felt the weight of everything we'd lost, and everything we might have been. But before I could respond, she whispered, barely audible, I shouldn't have come. She pulled back, stood up, and walked out, leaving me alone in the dim light of the cafe, surrounded by questions I knew might never have answers.